Silakan.
Baik, thank you. Terima kasih Bapak-Bapak dan Ibu-Ibu dan seluruh peserta. Thank you for being here. So the workshop is, the theme of the workshop is on advancing Indonesian scholars' research and publication in international outlets. It is presented by National Research and Innovation Agency atau Badan Riset dan Inovasi Nasional atau BRIN. Terima kasih sekali Profesor Dr. Ismunandar dari BRIN sebagai PLT Deputi telah bergabung pada pagi ini dan juga di co-organize oleh the American Institute for Indonesian Studies. We are very pleased to organize this workshop to enhance the capacity of Indonesian scholars in the field of social sciences, arts, and humanities, and applied sciences to publish their research in international academic journals or academic presses. And in adapting to the current challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic, the workshop series is once again offered virtually, including through synchronous and asynchronous sessions. My name is Neta Anya. I'm with the American Institute for Indonesian Studies as its Executive Director. I'm very pleased to welcome our distinguished guests in today's opening of the workshop as follows. I'd like to warmly again welcome Professor Dr. Ismunandar, and thank you, Pak, for being here. And I would also like to welcome Professor Robert Hefner of Boston University, also President of APHIS, and Professor Sidha Chandra, Vice President of APHIS and also Director of the Asian Studies Center of Michigan State University. I'd like to welcome Dr. Isabella Tirtowaluyo, Assistant Director of the Asian Studies Center of Michigan State University. And also I'd like to welcome Professor Marty Hatch of Cornell University, also Executive Committee member of APHIS. Thank you for being here. And certainly I'd also like to welcome in gratitude of APHIS staff members, Dr. Josef Jacoba, APHIS in-country representative, and Bapak Anas Bentari, Program Manager of APHIS in Indonesia. In the next few days, you will be meeting the main presenters of the workshop. The first is Dr. Paul Kratoska. Dr. Paul Kratoska is Publishing Director and formerly Director of National University of Singapore Press, and he served on the board of directors of the U.S. Association for Asian Studies from 2003 to 2005, and is past editor of the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies and the current editor of the Journal of the Malaysian branch of the Royal Asiatic Society. And also you will be meeting with Paul Nerney, who designed, taught, and coordinated courses in English as a second language and English as a first school language for the Center for English Language. He also worked under the Provost Office to design, teach, and coordinate writing and critical thinking modules for the University Scholars Program and University Town Residential Program. More recently, he has conducted writing workshops for graduate degree candidates and junior faculty in Japan, Singapore, Malaysia, Taiwan, the Philippines, Hong Kong, and Indonesia. He's also mentor for the U.S. Social Science Research Council's Global Scholars Initiative. You will also be meeting with Professor Sidha Chandra, of course. And, prior to, I'm sorry. As you know, Professor Sidha Chandra is currently director of this Asian Studies Center of Michigan State University, but he was also director of the Asian Studies Center and associate professor at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Josef Jacoba, who will be speaking about presenting an international academic conference, is, as I mentioned before, the Indonesia country representative of APHIS. He's also assistant professor at International Relations Department, Faculty of Social and Political Sciences at Universitas Pelita Harapan. He has 17 years of extensive experience in academic research and higher education on Southeast Asian studies, Indonesian history in the United States, and 11 years in managing Southeast Asian Studies Research Institute in Indonesia, while also teaching and researching on issues in contemporary Southeast Asian studies, Indonesian history, international relations, development, and cultural studies. Without further ado, I would now like to invite Yang Terhormat Bapak Profesor Ismunandar for your kind opening remarks, Pak. We're very honored to once again have you here and to have your support. Thank you.
Terima kasih Mbak Neta, thank you Mbak Neta, and also Pak Bob, Pak Sidat, Pak Martin, and also Pak Paul. Selamat malam, selamat salam sejahtera untuk teman-teman dari Indonesia. Good morning for all of you in Eastern time, in Eastern time in the US. It is very honor for us in the National Research and Innovation Agency for many of probably Indonesians friends, and also especially our colleagues from US. Once again in Indonesia, we have doing reorganization of the Research and Innovation Agency. In last administration, the President Jokowi is making research and technology and higher education in one ministry. But in the second term of his administrations, he decided to separate again the research and technology. It was decided that research and technology become one of the ministry with National Research and Innovation Agency. And higher education has been moved back to the Minister of Education and Cultures. But after 1 year, and then he decided to do reshuffle again. So the research and technology now become one big family in education, cultures, higher education, and research and technology. While the research, National Research and Innovation Agency become one entity, independent entity, not headed by a minister, but headed by a chair of National Research and Innovation Agency. But all these changes, we always argue that all the services to all teaching staff or all the lecturers in Indonesia will be remain. So it's just a matter of moving from one room to others, from one minister to another, but we will make sure that everything is smoothly in the transition process. This, as Bu Neta mentioned, that we conducted the collaboration of the workshop through the pandemics. This is our second time doing in online basis. There are advantages and disadvantages of the online. By using online, we can have more participants. Well, usually when I visited I was in the class when Pak Sidat and friends having a class in Atmajaya, I think in 2019. It was only about 60 participants, and I believe, but with online, we can have more. And Pak Bob was kindly enough to have more than once a year. This is in I believe in about 4-6 months, we have already did twice of the workshops. This is very important for us in Indonesia. As I mentioned in our first workshop, that in terms of publication, we have succeeded in terms of the quantity. So for very long time, we have been behind among other neighboring countries in ASEAN, from Singapore, from Malaysia, in terms both of number and quality. When we mean by quality, we can debate in terms of number of publication in journals and also in journal, reputable journal, in measured by Q1, Q2, etc. So we've been in the last 5 years, we've been working very hard, now in terms of number publication. we already compete, even like we ahead of our neighboring countries. But again, in terms of quality, we still have many publications that in conference proceeding. We want to move from conference proceeding into full article in the journals. And this kind of workshop is very important and will very useful for our staff members in Indonesia. I believe this will give their background and also not only knowledge background, but then IFIS have kindly provided help also for selected participants to be mentored by selected mentors from IFIS. Again, thank you so much. Hopefully, our friends from Indonesia will benefit a lot. I believe I will be benefit a lot from the workshops. And for selected participants at the end of the workshop, will submit the draft that they prepare into reputable journals. Again, thank you from us from the BRIN, National Agency for Research and Innovation in Indonesia, to IFIS for our continuous collaborations. Thank you so much, and I believe that the workshop is very useful. Thank you, Pak Bob and Pak Sidha. We'll back to Mbak Neta. Thank you.
Terima kasih sekali Pak Ismo. Certainly, our relationship and collaboration with BRIN has been very valuable to IFIS as well. I would now like to invite Professor Robert Hefner to please Pak Bob to deliver a few words for us. Thank you.
Terima kasih Bu Neta, terima kasih Bapak Ismunandar dan Bu Neta, Bu Isabella, Pak Firman, Pak Sidhar, Pak Josef, Pak Paul, dan para hadirin di Indonesia. Sebagian besar dari para hadirin berada di Indonesia sekarang, kan? Okay.
There are also mentors, the US-based mentors that are present today.
Termasuk saya sendiri.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Okay. Jadi saya pakai bahasa Indonesia atau bahasa Inggris atau gado-gado?
Gado-gado.
Perhaps mostly English because our US-based mentors may not understand Indonesian, but I think our participants all understand English.
Gado-gado. Yeah.
Gado-gado, oh, yeah.
I just want to make a few remarks. First of all, what a great honor it is to be working with RISTEC again. At a time when Indonesia is in the midst of just momentous transformations, both in the field of research, but also academia. I recall many years ago, I won't even give a number, but it was more than 3 decades ago when I entered the field of Indonesian studies, and I got my assistant professorship at Boston University. A colleague welcomed me there saying, well, now where do you work? What part of the world do you work in? And I said, I work in Indonesia. And he said he was a Latin Americanist. He specialized in Brazil studies. He looked at me and he said, yes, Indonesia. Let's see, Melanesia, Polynesia, Micronesia. Which one is it next to? No, it's next to amnesia. Now, for those of you who perhaps don't get the joke, let me say amnesia means it refers to something that's not known and that is forgotten. And many years ago, it is true, Indonesia, in light of its size and importance in the world, was a country that in the United States was insufficiently known. That's changed. That's changed dramatically. With the successful transition to to electoral democracy, with the creation and continuing vibrance of its economy, with its outward reach and the prominent role that it plays all around the world, not least in Middle Eastern and Muslim world affairs, as well as ASEAN affairs, Indonesia today is much better known, much better known, and gets much respect as the great country it is. And I say that. Indonesia is not merely a large country, it is a great country. But now let me transition to our APHIS meeting and our RISTEC event here. One of the areas where, relative to its greatness, its achievement in international affairs and culture, where Indonesia still lags is in the recognition international recognition of its scholars. Now, this is not due to the poor quality of the scholars. I've again worked in Indonesia long enough that I have been struck in all manner of fields by the great transformation that has taken place in academia. Whereas before, international scholars, Western scholars, Japanese scholars used to play a kind of prominent role in whatever field it was, in the natural sciences, in journalism, in training staff. Today, those positions and that leadership is managed by a new generation of young Indonesian, young and middle-aged Indonesian faculty, staffers, and scholars who are truly international quality. They're international quality, but they don't yet have the recognition, aren't yet as familiar to scholars around the world as they deserve to be. So the great transformation in Indonesian higher education, training in the fields of STEM technologies, as well as natural science and social sciences and humanities and arts, the great transformation has taken place. There is a new and impressive generation of scholars, but that generation needs to project, and it's time and it's appropriate that it project its influence and its achievement internationally. And that, for me, my last comment, that is why this RISTEC-APHIS joint initiative is, in my view, both very important and very, very timely. It provides Indonesian scholars with an opportunity to refine their skills in writing for international journals, in publications, at a time when they already have, in my view, the academic skills to really be excellent scholars. They are excellent scholars. I've watched that change over the last 30 plus years. But to project the significance, the importance of that change, the grandeur of that change internationally requires one more step. And that's the step that I am honored to be part of, a small part of, in this initiative, joint initiative between RISTEC and APHIS, the American Institute for Indonesian Studies. So with those words, let me first of all thank again Bapak Ismunandar and RISTEC, and then of course my colleagues at APHIS for this joint event, which again contributes to the training of this outstanding new generation of scholars so that their voices, their publications, their research, their achievement gets the recognition that it deserves all around the world. So with those words, let me say thank you again to the organizers. Thank you, Pak Ismunandar, Buneta, Isabella, and my colleagues at APHIS. And let me just wish you all a wonderful collaborative experience during the workshop this week. Thank you. Salam sejahtera dan selamat malam dan selamat pagi semua.
Terima kasih sekali, Pak Bob. Great positive encouragement and outlook of the program. Thank you. Next, I would like to invite Professor Sidha Chandra. Pak Sidha, silakan Bapak.
Terima kasih, Bu Neta. Thank you so much for the opportunity to say a few words. I'd like to echo Professor Hefner's words of welcome to Bapak Ismunandar for continuing the relationship with BRIN. Also to our colleagues who are on the panel right now, Professor Hatch, Professor Kratoska, Papa Bob Hefner, Josef Jacoba, and our colleagues who have been organizing this meeting, Dr. Isabella Tito Valuyo, Anas Bantari, Firman Lung. I'd just like to say a few words to those in the audience. First of all, of course, welcome. Thank you very much for joining this workshop. As Professor Hefner said, one of the really wonderful developments that scholars around the world are seeing today is the unleashing of the research potential of Indonesia. And this is happening in a variety of disciplines. The government of Indonesia has emphasized the STEM disciplines in the past. Now that emphasis has extended and includes the field of Indonesian studies. which all of you are participating in. We think of Indonesian studies as the study of Indonesia, taken from any perspective, any discipline. And so one of the things you will notice today in the room with you, there are scholars from a variety of disciplines in the social sciences, in the humanities, and in the natural sciences. The goal of this workshop is to share with you the experiences of some senior scholars from around the world, not just the United States, in having their work published. Like you, most of the people in this workshop who will be mentoring you have had quite long careers in publishing their academic work. And most of us, I think, have learned a few lessons that we hope you will be able to learn the easy way, that is from working with us, rather than the hard way, that is from facing it in the process of trying to get your papers published. So for those of you who have been selected for the intensive portion of this workshop, that is working with mentors, please think of these senior members in the profession as being your colleagues. They are here to try to help you sharpen your papers with a view to getting them published in high quality journals. The one other thing I would like to mention is, by the time this workshop reaches its end, we will be beginning a conference on Indonesian studies. So the American Institute for Indonesian Studies is collaborating with a number of organizations in Indonesia to host an academic conference on Indonesian studies. We have a very large number of papers, and perhaps Ibu Neta can tell you a little bit about the number of papers and panels that we will be hosting during the conference. But one of the things the participants of the workshop, those of you whose papers were selected for the workshop, will notice is that, and this is the last part of our workshop, and that is a presentation of your paper at an academic conference. So one of the things that we would hope that you will be able to do is work on your paper, improve the manuscript, and then at the end of the workshop, you will get a chance to present your paper at an academic conference. This is a very important part of the process of academic publishing, because you will hear the viewpoints of people with whom you would not normally have a chance to have a conversation. And some of that feedback may very well contribute to strengthening your paper and improving the likelihood that it'll get published in a high quality journal. So welcome again to the APHIS BRIN workshop on academic publishing. We hope that you are successful, and anything we can do to increase the likelihood of your paper getting published in a high quality journal or a high quality academic outlet, please let us know. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Chandra. Yes, so on day 13th, actually on Wednesday, June 16th, there will be a specific session led by Dr. Josef Jacoba, and that is about presenting your paper or work in progress effectively at an international academic conference. So please join that session as well. If I may next, Dr. Paul Kratoska, if I may invite you to say a few words as well.
Well, given that I'm going to be saying a lot of words this evening, I don't know that I have too much to say at the outset, except that this is our second time around. And when I say we, I'm talking about the team that I work with, but we really enjoyed the first time. We've also done workshops in Indonesia. And each time we do this, we are deeply impressed with the topics that are being researched, with the approaches that people are taking, and really the overall quality of Indonesian scholarship. And what we're hoping to do with these workshops then is to help people understand how they can make their articles more publishable. I mean, what they can do to get them into high quality academic journals. So that's basically what we're trying to accomplish here. And with these individual sessions, with having the mentors, it really goes beyond just giving a talk, but we're able to go into a paper and talk to people about issues, how they might improve the way they presented their material, The research, of course, we don't deal with because my team is responsible for talking about how you present the material. But the mentorship part of this workshop, you also have subject experts, and they're in a position to talk to people about other sources that they may have missed, or just all the sort of things that relate to content. So that's that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kratoska. I would just like to remind the invited participants that if you you should have scheduled your first meetings with your mentors by now. So please, if you haven't already, please be sure to do so as soon as possible. That is for the first meeting with your mentors. Thank you. And now we come to the end of our opening session, but before we begin, before I pass the baton to Bapak Firman Lung, who will lead the next sessions of the workshops, I would just like to remind everyone again that this workshop the sessions are streamed live through the APHIS Facebook and YouTube channels. So certainly there will be questions there as well, but for you, all of you who are joining us here through the webinar, if you would like to ask questions, please use the Q&A functions or chat functions. We will monitor those two functions as well. All of you will be muted during the sessions, and yeah, hopefully you will find the sessions to be beneficial and helpful, and please don't hesitate to ask anything you can think of. We're here to work with you and to assist you in any way that we can. Again, thank you very much kepada Bapak Professor Ismunandar for being here, for your support. Thank you for all of the APHIS Executive Committee members, Pak Marty, certainly Pak Bob Hefner, and Pak Sidha Chandra, and again, Pak Paul Kratoska and Ibu Bella, the architect of this workshop program, so to say, and then Pak Josef Jacoba, and Pak Firman Lung, and certainly Pak Anas Bentari, the behind-the-scene architect of the entire organization of this workshop program. Thank you very much. And with that, I will pass the baton to Pak Firman. Silakan, Pak Firman.
Okay, thank you very much, Bu Neta. Distinguished guests and participants, good evening and also good morning to wherever you are at the moment. I would like to welcome you all to the virtual public seminar session of the Academic Writing Workshop for International Publication, presented by American Institute for Indonesian Studies, or IFIS, along with Indonesia's National Research and Innovation Agency, known as BRIN. Well, it is an honor for me, Firman Lung, to be your moderator for this first session. We are joined by our presenter, the one and only Mr. Paul Kratoska, who will deliver a highly insightful discussion for all of us, revolving around several points, such as what journal editors look for, writing for publication, and as well how to get published. So a little introduction here. Mr. Kratoska is currently serving as the publishing director of NUS Press at the National University of Singapore. And I think I will not talk too much. Without further ado, I think I'm just going to give it up for Mr. Kratoska. Mr. Paul Kratoska, the floor is yours.
Okay, before we start, is everybody seeing what I hope you're seeing, which is the first slide, which is talking about the three parts of the session? Okay, some time back, I happily went through 2 or 3 slides when I was doing an online presentation, and then somebody stuck their hand up and said, "We're not seeing this." So the technology is great, but only if you use it properly. Anyway, I'm going to be talking about three things tonight, starting with what journal editors look for when they receive a manuscript. And you might ask, why are we starting at what is actually kind of far along in the process? That is, you write your article, you submit it. So why would we start a presentation at that point? And the answer really is that this is kind of a choke point. There's a whole process going on where you pick a research topic, you do the research, you write something up. That's all in your hands. At some point, though, you're going to send it off, and that's where you can get stopped. So what I want to start with is what journal editors look for, and then we'll talk about what you can do to make your manuscript fit the kind of thing that journal editors look for. Now, this is part of a larger workshop. So Paul Nerney and possibly Susan Nerney, his wife, will be helping out along the way. Susan has just had some minor surgery, and so she's laid up, and we're not certain she'll be able to take part. Okay, so to begin, what journal editors look for. You see here my name and also my Gmail address, and you're welcome to copy that down. And if you have questions later on outside of the workshop, do feel free to get in touch. I want to begin with a very simple question. Why did you write your manuscript? I'm assuming that everybody here either has a manuscript or plans to write a manuscript. As an editor, the one question I would really like to ask just about everybody when they send a manuscript in is, why did you write it? And there are several wrong answers to that. One wrong answer is my department or my university requires a publication. Well, this is actually a real motivating factor for a lot of people. And so it's certainly part of what's going on. Or my research grant requires a publication. However, there's only one right answer to that question from a publisher's point of view, and that is because you have something to say. Too many people are stuck in a situation where they're being pressed to publish, and then they've got to scratch their head and think, okay, well, what can I say? What do I have to talk about? And that's really going at it the wrong way. You need to look at your material and figure out just what you can say, what would be good to write an article about. Okay, so let's get down to the case. What do editors want? I would guess if I went around every person listening to this and asked that question, not one of you would give the answer that I'm about to give. People assume that what editors want is new ideas, interesting approaches to material. And of course, we want all that. The main thing we want is readers. A lot of editorial discussions start with a very simple question. Who is going to read this? And sometimes these discussions stop right there because we scratch our heads. This was true when I was doing books especially, but we scratch our heads and say, okay, who really is going to read this? Who's going to buy this book? And sometimes it looks like there's not much of an audience. And if there's not much of an audience, the time and effort and expense that goes into publishing something really isn't worthwhile. So authors really need to write something that people will read. I mean, if I were to sum up what's the simplest way to get published, write something that an editor or a publisher wants to publish. And I'll talk more about these things later on, but one way of doing this is that you write for a particular audience, and then you pick journals or publishers that serve that audience. So what do authors want? Well, actually, they want the same thing. Authors want to be read. Research needs to be read to have any value. The whole academic publishing system that we have now starts off in the late 19th century. And it starts off when universities began declaring themselves research institutions, research universities. And the university press grew out of that because of this very simple point. There's no value in a university supporting research unless somebody is reading and using the research findings. Now, in the 19th century, the assumption was that commercial presses would not be interested in the findings of academic research. It didn't really have any commercial value. And the only way to get it into print was to create a university press, which was not going to be a for-profit operation, but was just going to exist for the sake of getting material out. So the same thing is true of articles today. If nobody reads an article, it will have no impact. It will have no effect. In a way, you've wasted your time. And from a career point of view, I think everyone knows that universities value impact, and that this impact can be measured by whether articles produce citations. And obviously, if nobody reads the article, it's not going to be cited. So this brings us around to the question, if everybody's looking for readers, what then do readers want? Well, you can ask yourself that. When you read an article, what do you want to get out of it? And this is particularly important now because there are so many articles. When I started out, there were people who would tell you, I read everything that comes out in my field. And some people had fairly expansive fields, but they made an effort to read just about everything that got published in that field. The volume of material that's coming out now makes that sort of thing very difficult. So people are selective. And what it comes down to now is that you find an article and you make a decision. Is this article worth my time, worth my mental effort, the engagement, especially given that there are other articles around that I might read in preference to this one. So you make a decision. And I think fundamentally what people are looking for is answers to questions. Anybody in any field will have some unanswered questions. And sometimes an article comes up and it raises a question that I've never thought of. And I think, yeah, but that's really interesting. I want to find out what's going on with that. So I think the starting point on this is answers to questions. And that focuses you in on something I'm going to talk about, which is questions. Research starts with questions about facts, essentially. And,
I'm sorry, Mr. Kratoska, sorry for interrupting you. I think the slide is still on the first one.
Okay, it's not on my screen, so we've got to figure out what's happening with that.
Okay. I think you might want to put it on full screen, if I may suggest.
No, it's slightly more complicated. I've got 3 screens here.
Cool.
So I've got to figure out which screen to get, which screen is being viewed. Okay. What are you seeing now?
This one looks good, Paul.
But we are seeing your presenter's note.
It has the presenter's notes too, so we don't want that.
Right.
Okay.
I think it's the other one.
No, let me see if I can do this by adjusting the, okay, hang on. Sorry about this. Okay, I'm going to stop this for the moment and unfortunately, everything that I'm doing on my screen goes beautifully, so I can't really tell. Okay, let me just try this again. Okay, let's try this now. Okay, so what are you seeing now?
Readers.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. This
Are
is
you able
right.
to
First
move back
one.
and forth?
Slide 6.
You're seeing slide 6, and you're not seeing the notes that go with it.
Correct.
No, I think this is the correct one. Mr.
Okay,
Kratoska.
then we'll keep going from here.
Thank you.
So we've gone through this slide about how things need to be read. So what do readers want? And I was talking about answers to questions. So research essentially starts with questions about facts. And at the heart of this are questions about who, what, when, and where. But once you have the answers to those questions, who did something? Well, you then have a follow-on question, which is, why did that person do it? What happened? Well, why did that happen? And so on and so forth. So you need to start off by establishing a fact base, and then you go on and you have your analytical questions, which are the why and the how. Now, the answers to these questions are arguments. And this is true even of the factual questions. If I tell you that a certain person won an election, well, that's a claim. And then I would need to support this. Generally speaking, that's a pretty simple thing to do. The why questions can be much more complicated. But in any case, the answers to questions are arguments. So a good paper will begin with interesting questions, but the paper itself is going to be built around an argument. Now, major journals often receive hundreds, if not thousands, of submissions. Now, by major journals, every field will have probably 5 or 6, maybe 10 journals that are the premier places to publish in that field. And a lot of scholars think, okay, the way to get published is that you start off by picking the top journal and sending your article there. And then if that gets turned down, you go down a step, and then you go down a step further. Rejection rates at the major journals often exceed 90%. So one of two things is likely to happen. First of all, there'll be a preliminary editorial screening. Your article may be eliminated right away, and this is called a desk rejection. And several reasons down below would give you an idea of why a desk rejection happens. So one is that the topic you're writing on is not covered by the journal. A second one is that you haven't explained the significance of your article and the significance in terms of what it contributes to your field. A third problem is that there is no argument. Or if there's an argument, perhaps you haven't stated it clearly at the beginning. A fourth one is that there are not enough potential readers for your article. And fifth, that there might be clear problems with the sources. Now I'm going to go through these one by one and explain a little bit more. So first of all, does the journal deal with the topic? Well, how do you know this? There are two ways. One is that you look to see if the journal issues guidelines, and most journals do, and they'll say, this is the kind of thing we want. Sometimes they'll say, we're not looking for this other sort of thing. So you look at the guidelines. And the second thing you do is you look at the journal and you see what kind of articles it publishes. Just as an example, some journals are very heavy on theory, some are very heavy on data. So if your article is theoretical, or if your article has a lot of data, that can help you decide which kind of journal you want to go for. As for the significance of the topic, well, no topic is significant for everybody. So really what you need to do is to decide what audience you're going to try to write your article for. And somewhere in this, in the article itself, you need to explain why someone should read your article. You might say, well, it adds to what is known, or it changes what is known. But don't just say that without explaining in what way it adds to what is known. Now, editors have a pretty good idea of who reads their journals, and they will try to pick articles that will interest the readers who already come to their journal. So this is why it's very important for you to do some selection in the first place, to have a look at the journal and understand what it is that they're publishing. Okay, then, is there an argument? Well, an argument essentially is the answer to a research question. Some questions are important, and that means some arguments are significant, others are not. But whatever it is that you're trying to argue, it needs to be stated in the abstract at the beginning of the paper, and probably you state it again in the introduction. Okay, then there's the question of sources. So what goes wrong with sources? What does an editor look for in a new manuscript in examining the sources? One thing is to find out whether the citations and the bibliographic entries meet professional standards. Second one, is the manuscript up to date? Sometime back, I got a manuscript and I looked at the sources that were used, and there was nothing more, this was about a year ago, and there was nothing more recent than 1996. And that was a little bit puzzling. So I was trying to figure out, why does this paper come in with nothing more recent than 1996? I looked up the author, and I discovered that the author got the PhD in 1996. And that told me that what this author had done, this is how many years after the fact, almost 20 years, had decided, well, I need a publication. I'll just go back and I'll take a chapter out of my dissertation and I'll send it off. For me as an editor, if I see that sort of thing, I don't really have to do anything more. This is something that would be an immediate rejection. Is there original information in the manuscript? When you look at the sources, you look at the types of things that an author has done. If everything in the manuscript is just looking at secondary sources and compiling what's there, there's nothing very original in the manuscript. And once in a while, that's all right. I mean, after all, textbooks are used a lot, and textbooks really are doing that. But if you're running a journal and you're trying to publish exciting new research, and you get an article where there's really nothing very new in it, except the way that you've pulled together these things, the chances are it's going to be rejected. And finally, I may hate even to say this, but you look and see, does the author use Wikipedia as a source? That's a really good way to get rejected right away. Or are there a lot of textbooks listed as sources? And again, that's not an encouraging sign. So where does an editor look to find this kind of information? Well, generally, the editor will focus on the title, the abstract, the keywords, the introduction, and the conclusion. And for that reason, you need to use those things to explain your argument, explain the significance of your paper, and basically tell the editor why you think it should be published. Now, the outcomes, well, one possible outcome of this screening, of course, is the desk rejection. In other words, it doesn't go any further, and this could happen very quickly. And quite a few people that have come to our workshops over the years have actually said, yeah, I sent an article off, and 4 days later, I got the rejection. Well, what that tells me right away is that that was a desk rejection, that it was somebody looking at this and saying, this article for our journal has no hope, and we're not going to proceed any further. The outcome you hope for, of course, is that it will go out for peer review. Now, peer review for international refereed journals usually involves at least 2 reviewers. And normally these are double-blind reviews, and that means that the author doesn't know who the reviewer doesn't know who the author is. Now, the referees, the reviewers, are subject experts. So what they're going to be trying to evaluate is the content. They're going to look at the argument and say, what does this argument contribute to the field of study? They're going to look at the data and say, are these pieces of information something new, something that people will be able to use for their own research? And the conclusions, what do the conclusions add to what people already know? In other words, what is the contribution to the field of study? And one thing you need to understand is that peer review is an adversarial process. The reviewers are testing for weaknesses. Their job is to challenge what you're saying. They're going to challenge your argument. They're going to try to find where you've failed to get all the data you should, or where you've misinterpreted your data. And the goal of all this is to reject weak papers, but it's also to improve good ones. Now, people often are quite disturbed by this kind of feeling that the referee is out to get them. It's really not the way to see this process. So let's do a bit of Q&A about peer review. First of all, are all manuscripts sent to referees? And as I've said, the answer to that is no. So why not? Well, there are too many manuscripts, there are too few reviewers, and really not enough space in the journals. Just to give you an example, the Journal of Asian Studies a few years ago was getting about 400 articles per year. Out of those 400, they might select around 25. Now, every article that is considered seriously has to have 2 reviews. So if you had 400 articles, times 2 is 800 reviewers. And most of those reviews are going to be a waste of time, because you're only going to pick 25 articles. No journal is going to be able to do that. Reviewers are going to get sick of hearing from people and having to write reviews of bad articles. So this is the fundamental reason why you have the desk rejections. Now, who gets asked to do peer review? Well, basically established scholars. I mean, when I've gone out trying to find people to do peer review, once in a while, I'll pick somebody who's young, a recent PhD, who's in the field. But often I go to somebody who is a senior figure in the field, because I want to get that kind of breadth of judgment. Where does the article fit into the field? So sometimes people say, well, does that create some kind of a conservative bias? That is, are these senior people trying to protect their own ideas, the work that they've done? And in my experience, that's not the case at all. I've dealt with senior people who have said, well, I don't agree with this article, but I really think the person needs to get this out. What's being said here needs to be discussed. So by and large, reviewers, even the very senior ones, are supportive of young scholars and of new ideas. And finally, are reviewers paid? And for journals, the answer is no. And for people who are reviewing book manuscripts for publishers, the answer is yes, but not nearly enough to compensate for the time and energy that goes into the process. So what makes a good peer review report? Well, this sounds simple. The reviewer engages with the ideas in the paper. And that sounds so obvious. You wonder why I'm even saying that. And the answer is that sometimes reviewers don't. Sometimes a review comes in and essentially the reviewer says, well, I don't like what this person did. What this person really should have been doing is to write about this other thing, which is what I'm interested in. And when that comes in that way, fundamentally, the report's no good. So that's a bad peer review report where the reviewer is talking about what the author should have written instead of engaging with what they did. So what happens when referees disagree? Well, when I'm asked that question, I always say, oh, well, we can go out and get a third report. But that's not always the case. Sometimes you get a report from one referee that is entirely persuasive. Somebody who's obviously really thought about this and has engaged very seriously with the material. And a second review, which obviously hasn't done that. And if you have a really persuasive review, you may just rely on that. And do editors have to follow the recommendations made by the referees? Well, we always ask. Part of the set of questions that we send out is, do you think this should be accepted for publication? And usually it's put in the way of saying, should it be accepted as is? And the answer is almost always no. With minor revisions, with major revisions, or is it hopeless? And so referees will write, in their opinion, yes, this is suitable for the journal, subject, if the author makes the changes that I have suggested, yes, it will be suitable. Do editors have to follow these recommendations? The answer is no. The decision for this is in the hands of the editor and not the hands of the referee. The referee's positions and opinions are advisory. They're taken seriously. But I think every editor occasionally publishes something where a referee has said no. Okay, well then another question that comes up, are double-blind reviews really anonymous? And the answer to that is we try to keep them anonymous, but reviewers very often figure out who it was that wrote a paper. Sometimes somewhere in the paper, the author has referred to the author's own publication. Sometimes the bibliography has a lot of pieces by that same author, and it's pretty obvious who wrote it. So is that a problem? Well, I don't really think it is for the most part, because most referees are quite conscientious. Is there a better way to review manuscripts? Well, a lot of people have suggested that there must be. And I think the best way to explain this is that peer review is more or less the least bad way of deciding what gets published and what not. But there are alternatives. So one possibility is open peer review. So everything is publicly available. People then will express their opinions also in a public forum. Then there is a limited peer review. And by this, I'm thinking about what happens with what is called mega journals. These are journals that are huge. They'll publish 30,000 articles a year. And often what they will say is that they will review methodology. And if the methodology is sound, then the article will be published. So they're not concerned about the content. And they leave that pretty much up to the reader. Or a final option that people like to suggest is we'll just forget about peer review. We'll just put everything out, and the readers can decide on an article's value. Now, the problem with that is the sheer volume of material that's being written, and the fact that it is already a difficult choice. What am I going to spend my time reading? And one way that I decide is I try to look at the journal and say, well, is this a journal that I really trust? Is this a journal that I rely on to have screened material, and that this will be something worthwhile? And if I could just add a sort of side note on this, I was struck by an interview that I heard on a news program the other day. And there was a woman in the US who was talking about something, pretty crazy. And the interviewer said, well, why would you believe this? And her answer was, well, of course it's true. I saw it on TV. Well, the problem with having no peer review is that articles go out, and if they're complete rubbish, they still go out. People will read these things, and there's no kind of screening, there's no kind of check on what that material, what's in the journals or in the public view. So given what I've said, how do editors decide what gets published and what doesn't? Well, it's only based in part on peer review, and there are quite a few other considerations. One is, how many articles does the journal have on hand to put into future issues? And if there are a lot of journals that are already in the queue, then a journal is going to be more selective. If they're a bit short, then they'll be the opposite, a little bit less selective. They'll look at these articles from a relative point of view and what's the significance of one article compared with other submissions. And just to add to that slightly, the somewhat strange thing about being an editor is that you're picking among all these articles that come in, and everyone is different, everyone is unique. And so you can go to a supermarket and you can look at two oranges and you can maybe say, well, this orange is better than that orange. But if you're talking about two articles, it's difficult to say that one is better than the other because they're really completely different. They're completely different pieces of research and writing. So you have to make a judgment because you can't publish everything that comes in. And partly what you do is look at the significance of the article. Has the topic been covered recently? Sometimes a journal will publish maybe even a special issue on a particular topic. And so other people will say, oh yeah, I've got an article on that too. So they're interested in that subject and they'll send it in. Sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. The Journal of Asian Studies some time back published an article that had to do with Korean literature. Now, the Journal of Asian Studies covers a very wide range of fields, and they don't do very much on Korean literature, but they found an article that was really good. They were then subjected to a whole series of other people writing about Korean literature, sending their articles in and being quite disappointed because this was not something that they really intended to highlight. Is the article part of an ongoing discussion? Well, frequently journals will publish a series of articles that are somewhat interrelated, somebody responding maybe to an earlier article. When I was editing the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, somebody wrote me one time and said, well, as I was doing my research, I realized that quite a few of the articles that I used were published in the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies. So I thought you might be interested in this. And he was absolutely right. We published that article. And then there's the question of how much editorial work is going to be required. And so you can look at the quality of the writing. How many sentences are going to have to be rewritten, and all that sort of thing. It's a time problem for the editor. So a very frequent outcome, people get a letter that is revised and resubmit. Now, sometimes the revision is minor and sometimes it's major. But people sometimes look at this and they're discouraged. It feels like a rejection because the paper hasn't just been accepted. Again, going back to the Journal of Asian Studies, there's a journal that's very hard to get into. And a lot of the time when they've had an article that they were somewhat interested in, they sent a revise and resubmit. And frequently the author then just disappeared. And the people that were handling the editorial side said, we don't understand this, because if we engage with an author, it means we're interested. It means that there's a reasonable chance that this article will be accepted. So why is it that we send out the revise and resubmit and they decide, oh, well, it's too hard, I'll try something else. So if you get that, understand that this means that the journal is interested. Now, just to give you an idea of how some of these things work, the American Political Science Review is a major publication in political science. And I have the figures from 2017, 2018. They received over 1,200 submissions. Now, 34% of these submissions went back to the author for what they called technical reasons. And I don't know what those technical reasons were, but so they're thrown out. That left 814. Of those 814, 40% were sent back with desk rejections, that is, no referee's report. 51% were rejected after peer review. 9% were invited to revise and resubmit. And if you add all that up, you can see where this is going. None, 0%, got accepted without revision. Okay, so I'm going to take a quick break. We'll say 5 minutes so people can stretch their legs, and then we'll start up again. Well, my watch may not be accurate. Just say 5 minutes, and then we'll start again.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we will have a 5-minute break. The session will start again at around 15 to 8 p.m. Western Indonesian time. See you. Thank you.
I wonder whether this might not be a good time for, just to respond to some of the questions in the question box. If any people on the panel who are still here, who are not taking the break, might be interested. A number of good questions.
Well, I'm hanging around, so yeah, you could go ahead and ask the questions. Somebody who's monitoring it.
So why don't I do that? So there's a question from Uni. How to avoid putting self-opinion or assumption instead of argument in writing a manuscript?
Well, an argument is an opinion, but the question is whether you have evidence for it. Or maybe call an argument a judgment. It's an interpretation, lots of words we could use. But the key thing is you are basing it on the information that you've collected. You're basing it on your data.
So it's also very important that whatever you say, you back basically, and this is basically the same thing that Dr. Kratoska said, but slightly differently. Back it up with facts. And every fact that you state, make sure that you have a reference or two to back that up, right? I think if you do that, you have a much more credible argument.
Well, you would have to, you have certain things that are public knowledge, common knowledge. And so those things you don't need to support, but it's the new information that you have, or some information that may argue against what somebody else is saying. That's where you really need to, you supply the facts and you supply your sources.
So we have another question from
Siddharth, sorry. I thought this would also be a good opportunity to share 2 questions actually that you've answered, because Firman can read the questions that have not been answered yet, because he's monitoring that. But I thought it would be worth sharing. So if I may, and then Firman will take over, if I may mention those questions, Siddharth. So the first question is from Ibu Kanti Pertiwi, and it is, what advice can you give to scholars whose work challenge mainstream understanding of a given topic, because this may mean there is limited quote-unquote readership? Thank you. And your answer, Siddharth, is that if your work challenges mainstream understanding, then it should be possible for you to refer to the work that conveys the mainstream understanding and to cite that earlier work. If you do so, and if you make a convincing argument, it is likely that the potential readership will be broad and that the editor will send it out for review. It is also likely that at least one reviewer will hold the view that you are challenging, so your argument will need to be well thought out and well made. So perhaps Paul can comment on that as well. I hope this is okay, Siddharth. Just
no, it's pretty much the same answer. You need to be persuasive. And the way you're persuasive is that you have support for what you're saying. But I mean, coming back, I guess you sort of made the point already, but if you're challenging a mainstream argument, if you are persuasive, the mainstream is going to be interested.
Yeah, and so the next one is also quite interesting. It's how to, so the question is from Kartika Marta Budiana, how to write a good paper to be published. I have been rejected not because they don't cover the topic yet, but because my writing is somehow not really good. So Siddharth's answer is that one of the modules of this workshop focuses on academic English, which is very different from conversational English. You will learn a few tips on how to write well for an academic writing readership. However, the best way to streamline your article, if your writing is not good, is to hire an editor to read and strengthen the writing in your paper. This is not an uncommon practice, also in the US. The scholar writes the manuscript and then hires an editor to strengthen the writing once the structure and ideas are in place.
The question really here is what is meant by bad writing? And so it can mean just writing where the grammar is not very good, where it's a little bit difficult to understand what's being said. But it can also be the way an argument or a paper has been structured. And part of what we're doing in this workshop is to offer advice about that sort of thing. I mean, we can't fix people's grammar, but normally Susan Nerney will do a session where she's talking about sort of common mistakes in the way people express themselves, in the way they write things. I think Paul Nerney is going to be taking over that session because, I mean, Susan's surgery was on her throat, so she's not talking right now.
Okay, Mr. Kratoska and also Bu Neta. I think we already had our 5-minute break. We still have around 5 to 6 minutes questions, Mr. Kratoska. Do you want to answer it right now, or do you want to?
Well, we're having a question session at the end of this lecture,
yes.
Yeah. So we may as well hold those back.
Okay.
There will also be a break between part 2 and part 3, so we can deal a little bit more with those then.
Okay. All right.
Okay,
the
so
floor is yours, Mr. Kratoska.
Okay, so now I want to talk about writing for publication. So this is a simple point. Research begins with questions, and writing begins with answers. Too often people don't understand that, and they start off an article by saying something like, in this article, I will try to discover, or something to that effect. And my point is that by the time you write an article, you should know the answer to your question. And your article is about the answer. You don't need to drag your reader through all the research process that you went through to come up with the answer. Research moves from facts to conclusions, and writing begins with conclusions and adds facts to support those conclusions. And research, to be honest, is very confusing and disorderly. I mean, most people start off and they say, okay, here's an area that I'm going to do research, where I'm going to do research. I'm going to pick up all the information I can within that circle, let's call it. And so they do that. And then they sit down and they've got this big pile of data, and they start trying to figure out how do they tackle this? What do they do with it? But writing must be clear and orderly. So your problem as a writer is, how do you take all this jumble of information that you've collected and turn it into something that is clear to a reader? And the answer to that, of course, is that you have to do some planning. Unfortunately, most people, when they enter the academic world, they have not ever been taught much about how to write in an academic context. They've done student essays. And there's a big difference between what you're going to do in a student essay and what you're going to do in an academic publication. So for the student essay, often the topic is assigned. But if you're writing for an academic publication, you're going to choose what the topic is going to be. And also the questions that you're going to answer. You're responsible for thinking up those questions and coming up with the answers. For student essays, a lot of what goes into the essay is going to summarize what other authors have said. A lot of it's going to be descriptive, and a lot of it's going to focus on data. Whereas with academic publications, you need to come up with new research findings. And the critical thing is going to be how you analyze those findings, that data you've collected. And the focus is going to be on explanation. So if you have the data, that's lovely, and you should. But at some point, the thing that's going to get you published is how you explain what you've discovered. Then there's the audience. And students are writing for people, for their professors, who pretty much know everything that is going to be in the student essay. So the professor is going to look at this and say, okay, this student has used these sources, and have they done a good job of presenting this material? Because they know the material, they can evaluate it that way. The audience, though, for an academic publication is going to be a group of readers who are seeking new information, and information that is going to be unfamiliar to them. So you have to assume that you need to contextualize, you need to present your information in a way that readers will understand what's going on. So the goal, in the case of a student essay, is to show how much the student has learned. Whereas the goal with a professional publication is to explain something that's new. So how do you set about planning your paper? Well, I would suggest as a starting point, and this is before you start writing, you go through kind of a checklist of questions. And I've got some suggestions here. So the first one is, who is going to read your paper? Who are you writing this paper for? And then why would they be interested? Now, be realistic about this. I've had authors come into my office and say, oh, you know, everybody in my field is going to have to read this. Well, you hope so, but the likelihood that you've written something that important is pretty small. Anyway, what question are you answering? And what is the answer to that question? How can you support that answer, and how will you organize your paper? Now, the thing about this is you don't want to lock yourself in. So you answer those questions, you sort of plan what you're going to do on that basis. You can change it. But without a plan, without some kind of an idea of where you're going, it's really very difficult to write something. Now, what I'm not suggesting is that you spend days or weeks or months trying to come up with an outline. But you do need to have some idea of where you're trying to go. Sorry. I hit the, okay, here we go. So to plan your paper, you're starting off with this pile of fact. Now, in order to write something, you need to organize your information. And one thing that I was advised as a graduate student, and I think it was extremely good advice, somebody said to me, look, you collected all this information. You sort of know what's there. Read it again, and then read it again. And as you do this, you're going to discover relationships between some of the facts that you've found. And I mean, you pick these things up one at a time. But if you start reading the material over again, you will see things you didn't see when you first wrote it down. And secondly, figure out what questions you're able to answer. And you can ask questions about every single bit of factual information that you've collected. And a lot of those questions are not going to be very interesting. You certainly can't write an article on that basis. So your question here really is, questions are interesting? What questions will give an answer that somebody would like to know, that somebody would like to read? So having done that, then you pick a question, you answer that question, and you support your answer. So let's take an example. Some articles just stop at presenting factual information. So they have a fact, which, as I said, a fact is an argument. The fact may be the birth rate is declining. And the evidence for this is that you've collected figures showing the number of births over a certain period of time. Okay, now you could write an article and you could say, okay, within this 40-year period, the birth rate in such and such place is declining. And you might even get that published. But the obvious question that hasn't been answered is, why is the birth rate declining? And think what you can do with that. Okay, you analyze that question and you say, okay, the birth rate is declining because maybe the couples are marrying later. Maybe they have access to birth control. Maybe it's a concern about the cost of raising a child and the cost of education. Whatever it is, though, once you've answered that question, the birth rate is declining because of point A, point B, point C, point D, you have already finished writing your paper. Because what you're going to do now is you're going to have an introduction which says, based on my research, I have found that the birth rate is declining for these reasons. And then I know in that paper there's going to be a section about the age of marriage, about the access to birth control, about the cost of raising a child. So if you get a good question, and especially a question that takes this form, something happened because, and then you have these points, it's easy to write a paper because you've already outlined what you're going to do. And for publication, this approach, when you get to the why and the how questions, is much better. So what are the common weaknesses when papers come in? What do editors watch out for? Well, one thing is what we call the data dump. In other words, authors come in, they've got all these details that they have collected, and they kind of pitch it out on the table. Here's my data, here. I hope you can figure out something from it. And so they're expecting the editor or maybe the readers to provide interpretations. And a sort of variation on that is where you have what people usually refer to as a delayed statement of purpose. In other words, you start off telling a story. Okay, here's something that happened. And when you get to the end, then you explain what's going on. It's not a very good way to present an article, partly because editors are just really busy. And so an editor is going to look at your abstract, he's going to look at the introduction, and if they don't find an argument, if they don't find a reason for proceeding with the paper, then there's a good chance it'll be rejected. And so if you bury your argument somewhere near the end, it's really risky. The failure to explain the significance of an article, if you don't know what the significance of the article is, I don't think the editor's going to dig it out for you. A failure to engage with other authors. Okay, if you have written an article and you haven't talked about other people's work that is related to what you're talking about, this is a big problem. And finally, avoiding direct statements of causation. In other words, things like using passive voice. Now, this is a particular issue for people in, well, actually people in most of Asia, because a lot of Asian languages use passive voice very extensively. So let me just give you a quick example of how this can go wrong. we have a candidate for an election. And so somebody says, oh, that candidate was accused of corruption. Well, that's passive voice. So you know two things. You know who was accused of corruption. You know what the claim was. What you don't know is who accused the candidate of that. So supposing I tell you this candidate's ex-wife accused him of corruption. Well, it does put a different complexion on things, because the ex-wife may just be out to get the guy, or maybe she knows something that nobody else knows. So you can't really make a determination, but it is significant to know who made the charge, who made the accusation. Okay, so you write your article, you've come up with your argument, you've supported your argument, and now you're ready to finalize the article and send it in. And sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button here. Okay. Journals now are almost entirely read online. So you need to think that you're writing for a digital publication. And it's important to remember that articles are going to be found through online searches. And to help with that, you need to provide a title that's informative. You need to have an abstract that explains what the article is about. And you need to have a good set of keywords. And the reason is that, and I'm sure everyone's had this experience, you're looking around online, you've searched for something that relates to your research. And what you find showing for an article is the title, the abstract, and the keywords. So that's going to be what people look at when they make a decision about whether they want to find the full article. Now, if you're doing this in a university, you can probably go to the university library online and find that article. But it's still a bit of extra effort. And so what you're going to do first is make a decision based on the title, the abstract, and the keyword as to whether you want to bother. The second thing to remember is that as people are reading an article, nowadays there are probably hyperlinks within the article. In fact, a lot of articles now, if you look at the footnotes, you'll actually have a link there that you can click on and you can go to check out the source that the author is using. And readers are doing a lot of this. So they'll be jumping around. They may be into 3 or 4 different articles at the same time because they've started with one article and then they've said, okay, I want to see what this other author says about this. And so you go off and then you come back. Now, the problem with that is that an article usually is developing an argument. And if somebody is coming in and out of that article, they can lose track of what's going on. So you need to provide clear signposts as you're writing an article. And by that, I'm talking about the headings and the subheadings you put in. Also, the first sentences of your paragraphs to help readers keep track of where they are in the article, how they can follow your argument if they're coming in and out of the article while they're reading it. Okay, after you write the article, you go back and you think, okay, did it answer a good research question? I mean, you probably started off with an answer to a question, but as you wrote, you may have gotten sidetracked. So see if you really have gotten something explained. Go over the title, the abstract, and the keywords, because they are picked up by search engines and they're visible for online searches, but also because they advertise your work. This sort of thing will attract readers to your work. Then you go through your headings and see if they provide a kind of an outline of your article. One thing you could do is just, you copy all of the headings and subheadings that you've put in. Just copy them into a different document and then read through them and say, okay, if I was just reading this, what would I understand about the argument or about the article? And then do a good check of the citations and bibliography, because as I said, an editor is going to look at those things. And so be sure you haven't been too careless about this. So let me talk about some of those things in a little more detail. A title. Titles are really difficult because it needs to do a lot of things, and you have only a very small number of words, probably about 10 or 12 words to do it. And in that space of 10 or 12 words, you need to indicate what the topic is. You probably should position your material in time and in place. You need to say something that will attract readers. And this might be the angle that you've taken in the article, the kind of new information that's there. And as I say, you only have a few words in which to do it. So how do you come up with this? And generally speaking, I think what you do is you talk it over with somebody. If you have a friend that you can just go back and forth with. But over the years, I've developed a lot of titles for people, or with people, I should say. And frequently what happens is that we're just doing email back and forth. Well, what about this? No, I don't like that. How about that? And eventually, as you do this, you'll realize you're kind of working around some idea that obviously is the kind of thing that where you want to wind up. But the kind of exchange, just going back and forth, well, try this, try this, try this, is the best way to get a good title. What a title should not have is jargon. It should not have a lot of obscure terms. Don't try to be clever or cute, and don't use unfamiliar abbreviations. So UN, USA, fine. But there are a lot of abbreviations around that only a few people are going to know, when you want to attract people more than maybe the number who know what the abbreviation is. Okay, as for the abstract, an abstract should be fairly short, somewhere between 150 and 200 words. And in that abstract, again, you state what the research topic is. You present the answer to your research question. You explain the significance, and whatever it is you write, somebody reading just that abstract should have a pretty good idea of what question you've answered, what your argument is, and what kind of material you have in your paper. What an abstract should not do is describe the existing literature. It shouldn't try to explain or criticize what other writers have said. And it should not be loaded down with a whole lot of detail. That's what the paper is for, is some of these other things. But the abstract is really a summary of what you have done. Sometimes somebody will come in with an abstract that essentially says, this article will discuss A, B, and C. This is not good. What I want to see instead of that is something like this. Based on a study of A, B, and C, I conclude that, and then state what the conclusion is. And certainly I don't want to see somebody saying, in this article, I attempt to show, or I hope to, or I try to demonstrate. Because by this time, you're writing an article which is based on your research, which you have gone through trying to analyze and understand something. So by the time you're writing an article, you should know the answer to your research question. And what I really want to see as an editor is, in this article, I show something, or I demonstrate something. Or if that feels a little bit too strong, then say, in this article, I argue that. And then you say what it is that you're arguing or demonstrating or showing. Don't feel like you want to hold back that answer until the end of the paper. This is not a murder mystery. This is not where you are going to hold back and say, okay, I'm going to give you this information, and in the final chapter or the final paragraph, I'm going to tell you who the killer was. You really want to get this up at the beginning, and you're basically saying, here is my argument. Now I'm going to show you how I support that argument. And then the article is going to do that. Okay, as for the keywords, their job is to attract readers and to guide online searches. So how many? Well, probably 5 to 10. And those words should be words that might be used in a search. So just, again, you are both a reader and a writer. As a reader, if you were looking for an article related to what you've done, what kind of words would you do a search on? Now, a keyword doesn't have to be a single word. Oftentimes, when what you put into keywords is a very short phrase, 2 words, 3 words, 4 words, and not just single terms. And there is something called a word cluster analysis tool. And if you can get that online, if you try that out in your article, you can find out what words you've used a lot. And that's a way to pick out something that might be suitable as a keyword. But after you choose a bunch of keywords, then the best thing you should do is to go to something like Google Scholar and do a search on the words that you have picked and see what kind of articles come up. And what you're hoping for is that they will be articles that are talking about the same kind of thing you're talking about. In other words, you're trying to find keywords that will attract readers. And so if you can see, okay, this is an article that the person who read that article probably would like to read my article. That's what you're after. As for the citations and bibliography, journals have style sheets, and you can usually get this online. So get hold of the journal's style sheet, which will give you some specific things that the journal wants. Oftentimes they'll then turn around and say, all right, these are our special features. If you have any other questions, use something like the Chicago Manual of Style. Now, there's certain standard formats for citations and bibliographies, and the 2 basic ones are in-text citations. And this is where you put the author and the date, and if it's a quotation, you put the page number. And then the bibliography will have the author's name followed by the year, and then all the other details. The other one is footnotes or endnotes. And with those, what you do is you put the full details in on the first entry. And then for subsequent entries, you use a short form. Some journals want bibliographies, some do not. But if you're using the in-text citations, there has to be a bibliography, because that's the only way you're going to find out the details of the source that's been used. And a bit of general advice. Sloppiness is really going to hurt your chances of success. So if there are a lot of typographical errors, if there are a lot of spelling mistakes, editors are going to notice that. And especially now, because Microsoft Word is going to tell you where you have screwed up by putting a little line underneath the word that says there's something wrong here. And so fundamentally, if you don't care enough about your work to go through and fix it up, then don't expect an editor to care much about your work either. Okay, the second thing is, oftentimes when people are writing a paper, they put comments to themselves, using the comment feature in Microsoft Word. Better check this. Or they send it to some friends or colleagues, and they'll read it, and they'll add comments. And then there's also the track changes feature. And so sometimes you'll put something in and using track changes so that you can figure out, do I really want to say that, or do I want to go back to the way I said it in the first place? That's all very helpful when you're writing a paper. But do not send it in with all that stuff showing. I have received submissions and I open it and it's just a sea of red. And it's pushed over to the side because there's on the right margin, there's all the comments. You don't want your editor to see all the comments. You don't want the editor to see all the changes. So accept the changes, stop tracking, get rid of the comments before you send the article in. I also get pieces sometimes where somebody spent a lot of time doing something artistic. Sometimes it's just as simple as saying, okay, here's the title page, here's the title, and here's my name, and then we'll go to the next page, and then we'll start there. This is all a waste of time. You just don't try and do this because the editor has no interest in these kind of artistic touches. Fancy typefaces, something funny about the layout. Usually what an editor is going to want to do is get rid of all that stuff. And finally, and this one just is a complete mystery. Back in the days of the typewriter, people were told after a full stop, after a period, you put 2 spaces. After a colon, you put 2 spaces. Well, hardly anyone these days has been trained on a manual typewriter. And yet people still persist in putting 2 spaces after the period, the full stop, and after the colon. Now, the reason those spaces were put in the first place is that on a typewriter, every letter occupied exactly the same amount of space. And so if you put a period, it made sense to put 2 spaces after because it helped a reader understand here's where a sentence begins. The computer, though, uses what's called proportional spacing and adds in enough space that it helps the reader figure out here's the end of a sentence. So you're just wasting a lot of time, and it's going to look funny if those spaces are left in and the article is published. So what a lot of people do, including myself, you get a manuscript where somebody's got all these extra spaces, and you do a global change. So you do a search for 2 spaces, and you replace it with 1 space. And I have personally killed off tens of thousands of spaces that way. And every time I do this, I find myself thinking, the author of these papers has gone chuk, 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 with their thumb on the space bar for every one of those spaces. And the author probably has gotten carpal tunnel syndrome just from doing that. And it's completely, totally unnecessary. Okay, so in summary here, the author of a paper has certain tasks, and there's really not anything too complicated here. You have a topic, and you have to introduce that topic, you have to explain it, you have to justify it, and you have to position it in the literature. And then you have an argument, which is answering some question about the topic. And you need to introduce the argument, you need to explain it, to position it, and to support it. And after you've done that, you summarize what you've done, and you say, that's it, off it goes. The question is, where do you do all those things? So in an article, you have these different elements. You have a title, you have an abstract, keywords, introduction, the body. You might have a literature review. So in the body, you've got sections and subsections. You have a conclusion, and then the notes and the bibliography. So the question is simply this: where do you introduce the topic? You do it in the title, you do it in the abstract, you do it in the introduction. Where do you justify it? Where do you position it? So the same thing with the argument. Where do you introduce the argument? Where do you explain it? Where do you position it? And so you look at what you've got to work with there, and you think through where you have done all these things, because there's a logic to what you need to do, and there's a logic to the structure of the paper. And then while you're doing this, be aware of what the editorial concerns are going to be. So you've got the audience and the significance, which we've talked about. The editor is also going to be concerned about the author. And what the editor wants to know is whether the author is authoritative. Can you trust the author's opinion or judgment about the material? And so you need somehow to indicate why you are appropriate as a writer for what you've done. So if this is your PhD dissertation work, okay, I've studied this for 2 or 3 years for my dissertation, so I know this material, and I've written this article. Or I had a research project, something of that sort. Will tell an editor, yes, this person knows something about this. Okay, then the editor is going to be looking at the argument, looking at the writing, looking at the mechanics, and then I'll talk about this on another occasion during this workshop, but also looking at the paper from the standpoint of scholarly ethics, questions of copyright, questions of plagiarism. Okay, so with that, we come to our second break. And if somebody has questions, I guess we could deal with those. So we'll take it again, probably 5-6 minutes.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Kratoska, for the elaboration. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we will have around 5-minute break. And while doing so, we will have a few questions to be entered by our speaker for today. So, Mr. Kratoska, I'm just going to directly go with the first question. It is from Bonar Hutapea. Dear Dr. Paul Kratoska, according to your experiences and opinion, what exactly do the editors or reviewers mean by novelty? Should an author state explicitly in the abstract and the manuscript? And how should we write it elegantly that will meet their expectation? Thank you.
Well, people who tell me that they've done something new always make me a bit suspicious. If you've done something new, you present what you have done. And as an editor, novelty isn't quite the word that I would use, but you want something that is original, and that's probably what people are getting at when they say novelty. Some aspect of what you've done is original. Nobody writes an article that is totally original, because you're always building on what other people have done. So you start off with this kind of knowledge base that already exists, and you then are adding something to that, or maybe disagreeing with something that's already there. So pretty much the way you present the point that you've got something new or something novel is by talking about, okay, my information says this, that is consistent, but goes beyond what other people have done. But if you just come out and say, my idea is novel, is new, I think that just makes me suspect you don't really know what you're doing at all.
All right, thank you, Mr. Kratoska. The second question comes from.
Oh wait, sorry.
Azalea.
There was a second part to that question, I think, wasn't there? There was.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So it's still about how should we write it elegantly that will. So that
elegantly,
will meet
yes.
their expectation. Yeah.
I wouldn't really worry much about elegance. Pragmatism is what you're after here. You've got information. Especially if you're writing in a second language, then you really want to focus on getting something said simply, correct, so that people can understand what it is. I don't think anybody these days is particularly interested in the elegance of the writing.
All right, thank you. Second question comes from Azalia Muhrancha. She asked, what do you think about the system that hides articles behind a paywall but doesn't pay the writers? Do you think open access journals is the answer to the problem? Thank you.
I think that's too complicated to talk about right now, but I also recognize that name, and I'm going to be talking to this person in an individual session, so we could go into that a little bit then. There's a lot of good things about open access, but there are some problems with it that are pretty serious. One problem being that while open access means that the reader doesn't have to pay anything, but there are costs to putting out a publication, and those costs have to be covered somehow. So what happens in Indonesia quite a lot is that there are open access publications that are supported by mostly by the universities, and it seems to be working fairly well, although we had a discussion about this in the earlier workshop, and I think the position of the government is, well, yes, there are a lot of journals out there that are open access, but there are too many of them. But open access, I think, will quite clearly become, it's already quite important, but it's going to become more and more important as time goes on. And one problem that's starting to crop up is that the big commercial publishers, they're making huge amounts of money off of academic journals. And if everything was open access, libraries wouldn't pay. So the problem for these big publishers is, how do you keep libraries continuing to pay for this? And they're finding ways around this. So that, and the ways around this are actually going to increase what's already kind of a quasi-monopoly, with just a small group of publishers controlling a very large number of journals, which is not a good situation. Personally, I think that part of the solution may well lie in what's happening in Indonesia, where you have so many, I mean, there are a lot of journals. There's something like 9,000 journals in Indonesia. And if the government or the universities can continue to support journals, then the question is, how do you get them to be more prominent, to be more respected in their fields? And this is not really an impossible objective. If you take a look at publishing in China, what you'll find is that just about every field, there's a set of maybe 8 to 10 journals, which are the top journals in the field. There are a lot of other journals, but most fields there'll be this set of top journals, and Chinese academics are expected to publish in those journals if they're at a good university, in addition to some English language publishing. And the quality of those Chinese journals is really good. And so I think as a model for Indonesia, 9,000 is undoubtedly impossible to have 9,000 high quality journals. But if you were to have a few hundred that became the sort of standard for where people respect the journal as publishing really good articles, then I think that would be a lot of progress. And the fact that you can get into those journals without having to pay to publish, because a lot of the open access journals in the West, you have an article processing charge to get into them. And this charge can be quite high. So if you're publishing in a Cambridge University Press journal and you want your article to be open access, yes, that's fine. They'll do it for you. You just have to pay them about $2,800, and then it will be open access. Long answer.
All right, thank you very much. And I'm afraid I think our 5-minute break is over.
Well, why don't we do? We're comfortable on time, so why don't we do 1 or 2 more, and then
okay,
while people
sure.
are getting back, settling down again.
Okay, Mr. Kratoska, I think I'm going to ask about a question with this. In a way, it's still in the same tone with the journal. So Yanti Duyastuti asked, what do you think about the free and the charged Scopus journal? How do we recognize Predator's journal? Thank you.
That's another big one. Okay, there are lots of different clues. I'm going to talk about this actually in a later presentation, but the thing you want to do if you're evaluating a journal, first of all, there's some online lists, and you can take, some of them are free, some of them are library subscription lists, but that will say this is a journal that's suspicious. The second thing is you check who is on the editorial board. And if in your field, you should know some people who are likely to be on editorial boards. If the board is people you've never heard of, okay, they may be all right, but look them up. See what they've published. So that's the second one. Third, you look at the language on the website. And frequently the language is really broken English on these websites. And fourth, these are open access journals. So, I mean, the whole point about this type of journal is that they're collecting money. So you can look up the journal and see what they've published and see whether the articles look like they're any good. So these would be the kind of starting point for trying to figure out if something is a predatory journal or not.
All right, thank you very much. I think I'm going to ask you one more question before we continue our presentation.
Okay.
For, tonight, okay, this is from Herman Felani Tanjung. He asked how important it is, how important is the aspect of multidisciplinary in publishing? Will it get more possibility to be published compared to a single discipline research? Thank you.
In a way, almost everything you do is multidisciplinary. So it's a bit of an artificial distinction to say, okay, this is a piece in geography or anthropology, which means it's not history. But I mean, going back to when I was a graduate student, people were recognizing that if you do anthropology without paying any attention to history, but you just take a slice of time at the present, you're not going to understand a lot of things because what's happening now grows out of what's happened in the past. So you really can't do pure anthropology. And if you're doing history, then you're doing sociology, anthropology, all this stuff in one way in the information you're putting out. So there's that side of it. This idea about multidisciplinary work being good, I mean, I don't want to criticize it exactly, but I think it's how do we put this? I think it's overstated maybe as something of value. So yeah, maybe I better leave it at that. Okay, so okay. I'm going to, okay, I need to start up a new PowerPoint now. And let's see if I can make this one work better than I did the last time. I'm having trouble getting rid of I've got this bar up at the top, which is blocking my, let's see, I can start it over here. Okay, so what are you seeing now?
It is still in the editing screen.
Yeah, hang on. It says screen sharing is paused.
Okay.
How do I get it to stop pausing? Okay. Oh, there it is. Resume share. Now what are you seeing?
I think it's still on the editing screen, Mr. Kratoska.
Okay. Let me try it again then. Okay.
Yeah, to all of the attendants, I would like to remind you that we still have Q&A sessions after this presentation. So if you have any questions towards Mr. Paul Kratoska, feel free to text with using the Q&A chat box. Thank you.
Okay, so what are you seeing now? Are you seeing part 3 or?
Yes, I think this one is perfect.
This one's right. Okay.
Cool.
Yeah. Okay. So what I want to talk about now is getting published. So you may ask, well, what do I need to know about this? I mean, I'm a writer. I do the research. I write the article. I send it off. And then that's your job. You're the editor. You're the publisher. You deal with that part. And once upon a time, that was more or less true. But right now, there are quite a few things that an author really needs to understand. And so I've got a list of them here, and it's a fairly long list. But in the course of this workshop, I think we're going to be talking about each one of these things. So they're institutional repositories, preprints, citation indexes, impact factors, metrics and alt metrics, ORCID identifiers, article processing charges, open access, copyright, Creative Commons, mega journals, and bogus publications. A couple of these have come up already. So let's start off with picking a journal. Now, I've talked a little bit about this already, but journals will serve a community of readers. Each journal has its own set of readers. And when you contribute to a journal, you are joining an ongoing conversation. So first thing you need to be doing is figuring out what kind of articles a journal publishes. Now, if you look at the older journals, frequently they did one of two things. Some of them focused on a region, so the Journal of Asian Studies, or on China, or on Japan, or on Southeast Asia, or South Asia. So that was one type of journal. The other type was a journal that focused on a discipline, but covered a lot of different regions. And so the American Sociological Review or something of that kind. But many newer journals have a much narrower specialization. And this has become possible partly because of the digital aspect, because you may have on a worldwide basis enough people to support a very specialized journal. Back in the days when you had to rely on people subscribing and paying money for this, you probably had trouble reaching that audience. But with a digital publication, you can reach readers all around the world and put together a reasonable number of readers. Okay, so one type of thing that's happened then is that these journals that are really quite specialized and quite narrow, if you're writing on the topic that they deal with, the chance of getting in are really pretty good. Then at the other extreme, you have mega journals, and mega journals will publish on just about every topic. And as I said, that some of them will publish around 20, 30,000 articles a year. Most journals will have some kind of distinctive feature. And so as you're trying to pick a journal, you want to figure out what that distinctive feature is, and you use it. So as I said earlier, some focus on theory, some like data number crunching, some like comparative studies. And so if you have written something that is a comparative study, say cross-border or something like that, then the journals that are looking for that kind of article would be a good place to start. On the other hand, if your article is not comparative, then you send it to one of those journals and they're going to reject it. So you check the journal web pages for guidelines. Now with first tier international refereed journal, okay, the significant thing is that they're in citation indexes and they're very widely recognized. So if you do get published in one of those journals, it will probably benefit your career quite a lot. But as I've said earlier, they receive very large numbers of manuscripts and they reject a very high proportion of them. But beyond that, a lot of times these journals will require extensive revision. So they want you to perfect your article. And this can take a lot of time and a lot of effort. And frequently when the revision is taking place, you won't have any guarantee that after the revision, they're going to accept it. So it's a bit of a gamble and it may not be worth it for you. And in addition, there can often be long waits for publication. So as a strategy, you might be better off looking for good journals that have less competition. How do you figure that out? Well, you can find out something about a journal usually now because a lot of journals will tell you what their impact factor is, how long the waiting time is. They may when they publish an article, they may say, okay, this article was submitted on this date, and now it's published on this date. In terms of Asian academic journals, there are two streams of publishing taking place in Asia. So one is international journals, and usually these are English language. The readership is local plus international readers. They will appear in international citation indexes. And the topics that they publish on will be part of the, what you might call the international academic discussion. And they'll follow international writing conventions. Now, the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies is an example of this. It's a journal published by Cambridge University Press, and it is in the major citation indexes. There are a lot of journals on China and Japan. The same thing is true. So if you are writing something that is for an international audience, and it's going to be part of a discussion that's going on in the national audience, then this is the type of journal you should look for. Then there are a whole lot of what you might call national level journals. And these may be in English, but quite a lot of them are Asian language journals, which means that their target audience is domestic readers. These journals are not usually found in the international citation indexes. And the topics that they publish on are often topics of local concern rather than international concern. And they may be following local writing conventions rather than international conventions. We'll be talking about writing conventions later, so I won't try to explain that right now, but let me just give you a quick example about these topics of local concern. I used to edit the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, and there's a Thai academic named Tongchai Winichakun, and Tongchai wrote an article in which he was looking at what Thai academics writing for a Thai audience were studying. And at that point in time, it was around 1995. And at that point in time, there was a lot of concern about regionalism in Thailand. And the Thai academics were looking at the nature of the different regions within the country, language differences, cultural differences, and so on. And this was not a topic that was really of much concern for an international readership. So he was pointing out the distinction between what the scholars that were writing for a Thai audience were looking at and what the scholars writing for an international audience were looking at. So regional journals will reach specialized audiences. So the Journal of the Malaysian Branch of the Royal Asiatic Society, Monumenta Nipponica, Journal of Siam Society, and so on. And then there are the university and departmental journals, and there are a huge amount of these. So I did a calculation at one point, trying to figure out how many journals are being published in East and Southeast Asia. And I came up with something like 40,000. Now, obviously, I didn't sit down and make a list of that many titles and count them, but this was based on various sorts of data that is reported. And it's a phenomenal number, because if you look at the journals that are published as international journals, international refereed journals, the number for that is probably around 30,000. So in East and Southeast Asia, you have more journals by about a factor of 10,000. Many of these, well, maybe many is not the right word, but quite a few of these national language journals are switching to English. And in Southeast Asia, quite a few of them are open access. But they're not in the international citation indexes. They're also frequently not particularly respected. So as I was suggesting earlier, I think this is an area where there's something that can be done to build the reputation of some of these journals. And you see, what I don't quite understand is why Asia, which has by now become a major source of academic research, why Asia still depends on the approval of the West for their scholarship. The fact that a lot of the top universities in Asia are evaluating their staff based on whether they get published in the West and whether they're in the citation indexes in the West. Okay, so anyway, when you're picking a journal, in short, what you need to do is decide who you want to read the article, write for that audience, but then find the journal that reaches that audience. So how do you set about doing that? Well, I have some suggestions for you here. And now we are talking about these international refereed journals. Now, I think you all know what Scopus is. It's one of the two major citation indexes run by Elsevier. And Simago it's an outfit in Spain, but they analyze the data that Scopus collects. The coverage of Simago is around 35,000 journals, which is a substantial number. Not all of them are these international refereed journals of high quality, but they pick up a lot of other information. In the social sciences, there are about 7,300 journals that are covered by Simago. And in the social sciences, the Asiatic region has just 272 out of 7,300. Social sciences plus anthropology gives you 427 journals. You can find this online easily enough. But if you're looking to find a journal where you might publish, what you can do is go to the Simago webpage. And I've got the link here. And you look under journal rankings. And then you select a subject area and a subject category. So let me show you how that looks. If you go to Simago's journal information, the Simago journal and country rank. And down at the bottom here, you see a box, which is subject areas and subject categories. So within that, you can pick a discipline and a subdiscipline. And what it will give you then is a list of journals. So what you're trying to do is figure out what journal might be suitable for your article. And if you do this, you at least will have a kind of a starting point. You can start going down that list of journals and see what possibilities there might be for you. Now down here, there's a box. And it may be that you want to get something that is in the Web of Science, which is the other major citation index. So if you want to limit the search to that, you can click that box and you'll only get the Web of Science journals. You can also do something on the Web of Science master journal list. And the place to go to get that is here, master journal list, clarivate.com and home. And you can search on keywords, that is the words in the journal titles. So if you search on China, that is journals that have China as part of the title, you will get 112 different journals. If you put Taiwan, you'll get 42. If you put Hong Kong, you'll get 16. If you search on Japan, you get 198. Well, supposing you want something by topic. So let's say you study genocide. So you go to this master journal list and you key in genocide, you'll get 3 journals that are about genocide. If you key in nutrition, you'll get 250. If you were to key in COVID, you will find none. There's no journal that's specialized on COVID, or at least not quite yet. The other thing you can do, they have a feature that's called Match Manuscript. You have to register with them to do this. But once you've done that, you can type in your manuscript title. You can copy the abstract into the box that it provides, and it will suggest possible journals. So here's the Web of Science page. And this is the Social Science Citation Index, the Arts and Humanities Citation Index, Science Citation Index, and ES is the emerging sources. So it's a bunch of journals that have just been added. So you have here a box for searching journals, and here you have one for matching the manuscript. So again, if you're looking for a place to publish, it's another starting point to give you some journals. And then of course you go to the journal webpage and see what you can find. Well, what about preliminary inquiries? Should you contact an editor before you submit a manuscript? If you're writing a book, the answer is yes, always. But if you're doing a journal article, no. Editors probably will not respond to a preliminary inquiry. The journal guidelines will tell you what you need to know about the journal. But generally speaking, with a journal, they just want you to send in the completed article. For a book manuscript, you should not ever send a book manuscript to a publisher unless the publisher invites you to do that. Now that used to be a serious problem because sending a book manuscript meant boxing up 300 or 400 pages and putting it in the mail. These days, of course, it's all done electronically. But even then, the publishers don't want you doing this, and they want you to follow the instructions. So if you have a book manuscript and you want to approach a publisher, what you do is you find out who the acquisitions editor is. Big publishers will have several acquisitions people, and they will specify what they deal with. If there's nobody that is interested in your particular subject area, it might be that it's the wrong publisher for your book. When you submit, you need to follow the instructions that the journal has put out. So most journals these days want electronic copies, and you send it in by email, and almost nobody wants a physical manuscript. A lot of journals use an automated submission system, and there are 2 basic ones. One's called Scholar One, and one's called Editorial Manager. Each one requires that you register as a contributor before you submit an article. And once you're registered, then you send the article in, you'll be able to track how it's moving through the system. And when you get a report, it will come to you through the system. So if it's Scholar One, these are almost the same in what happens. Scholar One, the first thing you do is you pick an article type. And then you upload the file, you list the keywords. When under reviewers, the idea here is that you can suggest people, and you can suggest people that the piece should not be sent to. Now, you may wonder, well, why would a journal invite you to send in possible reviewer names? Of course, you're going to send all your friends. The answer to that is that they're not really trying to pick a reviewer. They're trying to see who you think would be an appropriate reviewer for your topic. Okay, then details and comments. And then finally, after you've put all that information in, review and submit. Editorial manager is almost the same with one exception. They ask you to link your ORCID ID. Now, ORCID ID is a distinct identification for an author. You can get one for free. And the idea of this is that for some names, like if your name happened to be something like Smith, the world has got thousands and thousands and thousands of Smiths, and probably the same first name. So putting your name on an article doesn't distinguish you from a lot of other people. So with the ORCID ID, it's a distinct identification, and nobody else will have the same thing. So it's a way of linking together all the material that you've published. So it is a persistent identifier. So, and a persistent identifier is a unique identification code. Now, the thing then is that your name is not unique. Well, maybe if you have my name, it is, but most people's names are not. Now, you probably in a lot of countries will have an identity card, or you'll have a passport number. That will be unique, but you don't want to be putting your identity card number out for the whole world to see. So these things are not suitable. So researcher identifiers link all publications by an author. So I mentioned ORCID. There's a second one called Publons, which is connected with the Web of Science. There's an international standard name identifier, which I don't think is popular. And then if you publish an article in a Scopus journal, Scopus will generate a Scopus ID for you. You don't have to apply for that at all. So for the ORCID identifier, and I would suggest this is a good thing to do, you just go to this site, and if you forget, you just look up ORCID without the H, ORCID, and you'll be able to get it. Okay, other persistent identifiers, not for people, but for other things. So for books, there's the International Standard Book Number. For journals, the International Standard Serial Number. For digital publications, there's now a Digital Object Identifier. And these are assigned to articles, books, data sets, and so on that are in digital form. Now, these things are all acquired by publishers, so you as an author don't have to do anything to get them. And then there are registries for organizations. So there's a research organization registry and a global research identifier database. Okay, when you get a manuscript accepted, you need to prepare your final version for publication. So the editor will send you probably some requests and some questions. And you want to be prompt in responding to the editor. You need to check over the text very carefully. Find out if there are any mistakes, any wording problems. Because once you send the final manuscript in, it may well go for typesetting, for layout. And after that, it's harder to change. If you have images, illustrations, you need to provide high resolution images. If you're sending a manuscript in, you should put low resolution images into the manuscript. But for publication, the publisher will need high resolution images. Then you have the problem of copyright. And if you're using a photograph or you're using something that comes from somebody else, you have to be sure either that it's not under copyright or else that you have permission to use it. The journal will have a style sheet, so you follow that. And then once you've sent it in, it will be laid out and you'll receive page proofs. And you'll probably be given a very short period of time in which to read them and send them back. Frequently, it's about 1 or 2 days. And if you're unable to do that, you can talk to the editor, but you really are expected to move this along very quickly. So just recall that a publication is going to be with you for your entire career. And so you really want to be sure that it says what you want it to say. So be careful with your publications. Now, what can you do with a draft article? It used to be that people typed up an article and then they circulated it among their friends and said, okay, what do you suggest? These days you can still do that, of course, and it's easier because you can do it online. But you can also place a draft article in an institutional repository. You can place it on a personal web page, or you can put it onto a preprint server. Now, preprint servers are mainly used in the sciences, and they're very common there, but there are some now for the social sciences and humanities. And a preprint server is simply a place that you put a draft copy of your article. It'll be open to anybody who wants to look at it. And so you put it there and you await comment. What gets published in the end is called the version of record. And this has the pagination, so if people want to quote from it. And generally speaking, the version of record should not be placed in an institutional repository. This is something that a university is maintaining, and they invite people to put things there. It also should not be put on Academia EDU or ResearchGate, which I'll talk about later under ethics, but publishers really don't want the version of record put out that way. If you want to find out what journal policies are with regard to what you can and cannot do with your draft article or with the final version, you can go to this website, the Sherpa Romeo website, and it will explain what the practices, what the policies are for different journals. And with that, we have come to the end. So we can go back to questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kratoska, for the very elaborated discussion. And I believe you have answered most of the questions during the break time, but I have one left here on my list right now. It is a question from Ayu. Yeah, Ayu is from National Institute of Aeronautics and Space of Indonesia. She asked, how if my research topic has very limited data and previous research? Thanks.
Oh, if your research has very limited what?
Very limited data and very limited previous research. Yeah.
Well, well, you first of all, the data is what the article you're going to write is about. So, yeah, that's a hard one to answer, because normally what I would say with writing an article is that you start with the understanding what people have done in the past, and then you're building on that. So you add something to it. If there hasn't been much done in the past, it's a little bit surprising, because it's hard to find anything that nobody's worked much on. But certainly in the sciences and some technological fields, the past volume of material is probably pretty limited. But I think what I've said in this talk applies pretty much across the board, that you need to start off answering questions. And so you look at your data, whatever your data is, and you say, what questions can I answer using that material? And then who would like to know this? Who are you writing for? And then you proceed to answer the question. I don't know, Siddharth, do you have any thoughts about this?
Could you repeat the question?
What do you do if you have very little data and hardly anyone has worked on the topic before?
I think that if you have very little data and hardly anybody has worked on the topic before, it's going to be very difficult to convince an editor that there's going to be a good readership for that paper. So, you're in a very difficult situation. But I think this opens up a slightly broader set of responses. There were a couple of questions that were posed by an anonymous attendee, which I think were removed from the Q&A section, but which I think are relevant to what Dr. Kratoska was saying. And they also tie to this question. And I think it was something about, what if I only have a master's degree and not a PhD? Does the editor look at who the author is and so on, right? And what you probably noticed from Dr. Kratoska, one of his slides is, I think the one that had 3 columns, right? The author, then something about the presentation, and then the editor, right? One of the things the editor will look at is the author an authority on the subject? How authoritative is the author, right? So if somebody like Professor Hefner writes an article, let's say, he's a very well-established scholar in his field, chances are that an editor looking at that paper will say, this is coming from a world-class authority. I don't need to worry about whether this person is speaking authoritatively. Let me now look at some of the other attributes of the paper, right? If you are a new, and most of you are relatively early career scholars, okay, you are probably not authorities in the subject as yet. And if in addition to that, you're going to write about something that very few other people have written about, and you don't have a lot of data, my recommendation would be to look for a journal that perhaps isn't the most competitive and the top journal in the field. Start relatively low, okay? But keep writing on the subject and keep placing your papers in journals that slowly move up the rankings, right? That is one way to do it. A lot of authors, what they'll do is, before they publish a paper in a top journal like the Journal of Asian Studies, they will publish 2 or 3 papers in other journals that are perhaps not as well known as the Journal of Asian Studies. And then they will write an article for the Journal of Asian Studies, and they will cite 1 or 2 of those papers. And that sometimes is also a signal to the editor that, look, I'm developing into an authority on this subject. I am becoming an authoritative scholar. You should pay attention to me as such, right? So I think this ties into both the question that was asked earlier, but also what Dr. Kratoska said in an earlier slide.
Yeah, I think what an editor is concerned about is whether the person is qualified to speak on this. And well, okay, let's just use your Bob Hefner example. There are lots of topics that he might write about where somebody would say, what's he doing? That's not his field. He may have an opinion about that, but he's not an authority in that field. So it's not a question of the degree you have, but it's a question of why anybody should be interested in what you have to say on that topic. And sometimes somebody who has a master's degree, but they have a lot of experience, let's say they've got a lot of work experience in some field. Now they've done a master's degree, but what qualifies them is not the degree, but their work experience. So there are lots of answers to that. It's just the idea of not having much data. I mean, you can write up, I guess, what you have. If what you have is something totally new and different, then you still have to find out where can you place that. And if you find the right journal, yeah, you might be very successful with that. It's just hard to answer that question without knowing more specifically what the situation is, what the field exactly is, what the data is like.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Kratoska, and also Mr. Sidha.
May I make a suggestion?
Sure.
I think in such a situation, based on Dr. Kratoska's response, a good strategy may be to approach a senior colleague in the field who knows that discipline and that field and perhaps that topic well, and say, look, this is what I have. This is what I'm writing about. This is the quality of the data. Where do you think this article should go? So I think asking your network, asking colleagues in the field for advice at every stage of preparation and publication of a paper is always a good idea. Because there's a good chance that somebody like that person is going to be the reviewer of your paper as well, right?
No, I agree completely with that, yes.
Okay, thank you very much for not only answering the question, but also providing suggestions. I have one more question. This is a new question from Berti Alia Bahaduri from Universitas Kristen Maranatha. She asked, to what extent do we have to explain terms? For instance, a design term, since my journal is a graphic, fashion, and interior journal, will it depend on the journal scope, or is there any way, or is there any standard on it?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. It depends on the journal scope. If the journal is a specialized journal that's going to be read by professionals in the same field that you're in, you will need to explain less. But it comes back partly to this question of readers. And the more people that read your article, the more impact it's going to have. And what you generally are looking for is you have a core group of readers who definitely will read it because this is their field too. Then you have a bunch of people who are, I guess you'd say, in neighboring fields, and you would like them to read it. And they might well, because it's something that relates to what they do, even if it's not exactly the same thing. Now, for those people, you would have to explain a little bit more. You'd have to figure this out based on your own experience. But once you get outside of that, depending on the topic, you might well be able to attract some readers who they don't know much about your field, but something interests them about this article. And for that group of readers, you'd have to provide a whole lot more background. And again, think about who you're writing this for. The Journal of Asian Studies used to have a principle that they called the 1/over rule. And the way that worked was, let's just take an example. Let's say that you're writing about, well, let's just say Islam, something to do with Islam in Indonesia. So what is your audience for that? Well, there's an obvious central group there. People are interested specifically in Islam in Indonesia. But you would kind of like people who are working on Islam somewhere else to read this article as well. But they may not be so familiar with the Indonesian context. So you would have to give them a bit more background than if you're writing for a group of people who really knows Indonesia. And then, well, exactly what are you doing about Islam? Is it something theological? Is it historical? Is it sociological? So let's say you're doing something about sociology of religion, dealing with Islam in Indonesia. But you'd kind of like to have people who are looking at Islam in Indonesia from other disciplinary points of view read that article as well. And so again, for those people, you'd have to give a bit more explanation than you would if you're just writing for people who work on exactly what you work on. So there are a lot of considerations with this, but it really generally is the case that you want to get as many people as possible to read the article. So there's a balancing act here. If you spend too much time explaining what your readers already know, that's not going to be very good. But if you lose readers because you don't give them enough, that's not good either. I'm sorry, that's not a very clear answer, but that is the answer.
May I add to what Dr. Kratoska said?
Yes, Mr.
And I think this is sort of an extension of what he said. It's very important to understand the culture of the journal, right? You know, different journals have different cultures, right? And you know, some journals, I mean, one way to think about the culture is how, for me, because I'm a quantitative researcher, is how quantitative is the journal, right? Is it all Greek and theorems and proofs? Or is there just one graph and everything else is verbal, right? These send you signals about the culture of the journal and about how much, in my case, how much quantitative material I can include in my paper, right? So I remember one time I wrote a journal that was quite an article that was very quantitative. I sent it to a journal that had a very different culture. And the editor basically wrote back saying, you need to get rid of 95% of your math and your graphs. You can leave one or two graphs in, but that's about all that my readers are going to want to stomach. They want to see what you're writing in words, right? So to make a long story short, I think it's very important for you to take a look at articles from the journal to which you're going to submit a paper, to try to get an idea for how successful authors who have been successful in publishing in that journal, have communicated their ideas. Do they spend a lot of time defining basic terms? Do they put in a lot of graphs? Do they show a lot of math? How do they do it, right? That will give you an idea about A, whether your paper fits the journal, or B, if it doesn't, what you may need to do in order to align it with the culture of the journal.
Yep. Journals will have a sheet telling you what they are and they are not looking for, but the kind of thing that you just said, you know, heavily quantitative or heavily theoretical or, you know, narrative emphasis, they will not probably tell you that. So what you really want to do is start off with whatever they tell you about what they want. And this may be a geographical area or something of that sort. But then also looking at the journal is really important to see the kind of papers that they generally publish.
Okay, thank you very much. I believe that's all the questions that I have for now. Are there any questions from the floor? Or Mr. Kratoska, are the attendees allowed to send you further email regarding if they have any further questions?
They're welcome to. The email address is there, so if anyone wants to get in touch that way, probably wait till after the workshop. Well, no, I don't care actually, but I will be explaining some more things in I have about 2 or 3 more shorter lectures, and so some other things may get covered.
Okay, sure, because this is only our first day of the whole series, right? So I guess that's all because I don't see any further questions. So I'm just gonna close our session for today. So yeah, it's definitely a fruitful session. Thank you very much, Mr. Kratoska, once again for the insightful presentation. I'm sure that all of us who are attending today's session, and me personally, are learning a lot of new things regarding publications, you know, from content-wise to all of its technicalities that we all should be aware of in order to get successfully published. So once again, thank you.
Well, I want to thank the audience too for bearing with me as I had my problem getting the things up on the screen at the right place, but I guess in the end it worked.
No worries, Mr. Kratoska.
Thank you. If I may add, just a reminder for tomorrow, jangan lupa, don't forget, there will be, you know, day 2 of the sessions. So Firman, correct me if I'm wrong, but that will start jam 6.30 ya, sama seperti hari ini. That will be a topic about review and revision strategies, research paper introductions, led by Paul Nerney. And then right after that, again with Paul Kratoska, with the theme of current trends in academic publishing. So really hope to see all of you back tomorrow. So the first session will start at 6:30 p.m. Jam 6.30 sore waktu Indonesia Barat. Kemudian sesi kedua oleh Pak Paul Kratoska dimulai jam 8.30 waktu Indonesia Barat. So please be there. We appreciate it. And thank you very much, Firman.
Yes. I would also thank the organizers for today, Indonesia's National Research and Innovation Agency, BRIN, and also American Institute for Indonesian Studies, IFIS, for this first day, so that this first session could be conducted very smoothly. And also thanks to all of the distinguished guests and attendees for your enthusiasm for this first day. We are looking forward to meeting up with you again on this public seminar series. So I guess that's all. I, on behalf of the committee, would like to wish you all a good evening and also a good day for sure. I'm Firman signing out. Stay safe and see you tomorrow.
Siddharth, do you want to say something else, or?
Sure.
For the mentors who are in the audience, there will be an organizational meeting of mentors tonight. I believe Ibu Neta has already sent out emails, but there will be 2 other possible meetings depending on your time zone if you're not available tonight. So hopefully you've had a chance to at least assign one of these 3 meeting slots.